Welcome to Have You Heard, where we talk about issues at the intersection of agriculture and engineering. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Morgan Hayes and Josh Jackson.
Welcome. This is the Have You Heard podcast. This is episode 29. We're going to be speaking today a little bit about watering systems on the farm. I'm Morgan Hayes, an assistant professor in Biosystems and Ag Engineering at the University of Kentucky, focusing on livestock facilities. In my personal life, my husband and I farm in Boyle County, Kentucky, and we farm about 500 acres. It's a commercial cattle and hay operation.
I'm Josh Jackson, assistant professor in Biosystems and Agriculture Engineering as well. I focus on precision livestock farming, and my family, we farm about 250 acres, and we focus on beef cattle production and hay production.
Okay, Josh. So before we get started on our topic, watering systems today, we can talk a little bit about what's been happening on the farms this week. And let's just preface all of this with it's really hot right now.
It is.
It's been hotter in some other places in the country, so we're not complaining yet, but it's been a toasty week.
It's been toasty, yeah. So trying to get some hay done, had some equipment breakdowns here and there, so trying to overcome those. Went ahead and tagged the fall herds. We did go ahead and tag our fall herd. Had a couple of heifers, a couple steers in that group, had some pink eye issues. We went ahead and treated that and brought them up and kind of keeping them close so I can just keep an eye on them, make sure that we get that resolved. Did some additional bush hogging, trying to make sure that's resolved, and went ahead and rotated that fall group to different pasture. So a couple of different things, it's that time of year where we said last week, everything's going on at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would completely agree. We've been bush hogging. We have the remainder of our first cutting of hay is currently down. My husband's actually baling today. We're actually a day ahead on schedule, which both met some of the things that we had other obligations tomorrow work-wise, and then also farm-wise in the evening tomorrow. So this just gives us a little bit more freedom with our schedule later in the week, because it looks like hay is coming up later this week. So
yep,
getting hauled in. So that's good. We certainly still have equipment down. It was a fiasco last week. I mentioned all the things that were broken last week. And it's not like it's gotten broken. Better. Yeah. Instead we've just turned around and we're using other equipment, and we're just going to continue on. The push is to get the hay up as soon as possible. To be completely honest, this is a long, hot stretch. We've missed out on rain a couple times here that they've predicted in the last week or so, and it looks like it's going to be another 10 days dry, and that's a pretty long dry window in June. And the last thing we want is to not have cut our hay and to not let it regrow, restart. The best thing that could happen is for some regrowth to happen. The other thing we're really focusing on is rotating right now. The last thing we want to do is overgraze pastures, knowing that we're going into a dry couple weeks.
Yep. Talked with Matt Dixon this morning. He said, we have this dry spell here. Might get a little bit of a system coming through Friday. And then I think after that, he's pretty much saying we have another 2 weeks predicted of kind of this dry, hot pattern. So we have a low cool down, and it's going to go back to this dry, hot pattern.
And it is hot. It is very hot. It's very dry. The cattle are not moving easily. We have to do all of that early morning, late night. My son he's very young. He's a toddler still, but he's sleeping on a very odd schedule because it just so happens that the easiest time to move cattle is either very early in the morning or very late at night, and he happens to be a night owl, so we move cattle late at night rather than first thing in the morning. It is counterintuitive to what you would think would happen with small children, but that is how our life is currently operating. So we do what we can when we can, I guess.
Plus, when you work them in the morning, you have a very well-defined time limit.
Yeah, I would also say at this point, it hasn't really been cooling down at night, so I'm not sure that either later in the evening or early in the morning is particularly advantageous. It does get a little bit better, but it has not been giving us really good nighttime cooling, so we'd have to be out pretty early in the morning to get them to do too much.
All right. And then Dixon had another warning. Matt Dixon, sorry. He had another warning for us. He said next 2 weeks going to be dry, so we're always about 2 weeks away from a drought in Kentucky, it seems like. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always sort of the fear in the back of your mind, and the rotation on cattle is just so important. So that's
Yeah.
I've got 2 groups to move tonight. Also, our bulls are going in tomorrow.
Okay.
This is not exactly the weather pattern we would hope for our bulls to be most productive, but we'll be really cognizant that we're moving our cows with the bulls into fields that have really good shade, and hopefully not necessarily standing water. We don't want them laying in the water. We don't want the bull in the water. Everything gets vaccinated twice a year for lepto and stuff, but the last thing we want to do is pick up some out of the ponds if we can avoid it. So all of that's on our priority list.
And that kind of transitions into our topic for today is that water. I mean, we have to, on our farm, we have where the cows, we rotated this field now, it's like we have to put them there because if the stream dries up, there is no water. So we have to put them in this field prior to
a dry spell.
Yeah,
we are very lucky. We've had 2 NRCS contracts. Well, one was state cost share and one was an NRCS equip project to get rotational systems on 2 of our farms. So we have city water in all of our fields. One of them has pond water going into a tank, so it's not in the pond, but it's a tank attached to a pond. But it's a large pond. If that pond goes dry, it will be a major shock.
Or an extreme drought.
We'd be in a very large drought. It's a couple acre pond, and there's nothing else coming off of it other than the cattle on the place, and that's minimal number, maybe 20 cows. So hopefully we never reach the point where that pond goes empty. My neighbor who actually owns the pond and likes to fish there would be very upset with us. And it's only one of the fields on that farm. So for the most part, we sit pretty well. We have a lot of city water, which is both expensive and helpful from a flexibility standpoint. It gives us a lot more options year round on where to put cattle. We don't have to worry about whether the water source is going to be there.
Now, I know when you put in your waterers, what are you putting in? Are you putting in tire tanks? What are you putting in ball waterers? What's your preference for waterers?
Ball waterers primarily. We have both 4-ball and 2-ball, depending on the size of the farm and the size group that we're rotating. I've specifically chosen water tanks that are ball waterers where I can take off the lids in the summertime. So a large portion of ours also have lids removed in the summer, which just basically makes it a large open tank, plastic tank. I know you use tire tanks. I know that we as a university have done a lot of promotion of tire tanks, but I personally have never really been super invested in them. It's just never been my preference for a couple of reasons. One, it's a lot of work to build one yourself.
The cutting
of the tire is a lot of work.
Tire is a lot of work.
Exactly.
That's an understatement.
It is definitely an understatement. It's a lot of work, and it tears up some of your equipment trying to get it cut. So
yeah,
and it's really just the bands in the sidewall that are a problem. It's not actually cutting the tire itself that's a huge problem. It's the metal banding on the sidewall that's hugely problematic to cut through.
You can use the 10 TPI blades.
Yep.
And it just takes a while and takes a lot of force, and it's a labor intensive task.
Yeah. We do have 2 older concrete tanks that are both intact. They have no cracks in them. They work great. I have no problem. There is some real benefits to having a larger tank. So I'm not opposed to looking for options that give you a little bit larger tank, but for me personally, from a practical standpoint, the ball waterers are a very good option. I've had to fight a little bit with some of the valves in them, but I think that is just generally the manufacturing, and there's a lot of plastic parts where I would love to have a little bit more robust valve systems in place. On the other hand, some of our older concrete tanks, we have issues with the valves in those just because over time they do degrade as well.
Yeah.
So a little bit of everything, but we prioritized putting in city water in almost all of our pastures. Some of them are shared between 2 fields, and some of them are in the middle of the field. In fields that we know we might split with a hot wire to break them into smaller pastures, they're in the center. In fields that we have a lot of permanent fencing already in place, they're usually shared between a couple smaller pastures.
Oh, for ours, we have a couple different options on our farms. We have both pond water or pond water fed waterers, and we also have city water. And so, like the main system we have is city water, and we try to have at least, excuse me, one backup. So if the city water did go out, if something did happen, we have a pond or something available for them to utilize. Because that, if in the event that something did happen, we'd have something, a water source available for them. Um, we really like the pond water or the city waters, and we try to have ours. We have it set up a little differently. We have them set up as kind of a center pinwheel design. So a lot of our pond fed waters are directly below the pond. Put rock down there, leading up to the water, to and from the water, and have that be able to rotate between the different fields. The other ones we have, I have a city water in the middle of my field. It's still that pinwheel design where they come to this center location, and I'm able to switch between fields at that location. And so some of it's just like don't have necessarily split, and some we do have one that is split between the fence. Primarily, they're within a area where we can pretty much rotate between pastures, or use that to shift them between pastures.
I always like the design of utilizing your water tank as with a heavy use area there as a way to either move animals, or if you needed to capture something. There's real value in having that sort of flexibility in the water system. The one thing I will say is I don't think I have any fields where I have temporary water systems. I guess I have a couple small lots that aren't really attached where I have water tanks I have to fill by hand, male alpacas and things like that. But for the most part, everything is on an automated water system. I mean, it almost has to be for animals having jobs off farm.
I will say we do have the one set, so we are two sets where we have it's a temporary water solution. So for the goats, we actually have one of those IBC crates, and we fill it with water every week or two, and take it down there to them. We have it elevated, set on some pallets, and then gravity feed to a little automatic water for them. Okay. And so that is different, a little bit different system. You just have to be cognizant whenever I think they're fed daily or every other day, and so we'll just be cognizant of checking that.
I mean, you should be checking your water system anyway, especially with this heat. Make sure animals haven't destroyed or broken your.
And that's something we had to do as well. So I probably went through about a month ago and cleaned out all the waters on my farm. So where you get that gunk and everything else built up in there over the winter, just cleaning them out, making sure it's actually clean water instead of that. You get that almost like when you have the balls on there, it kind of festers and just turns to muck almost.
Yep. Yeah, we tend to dump every water as we start our rotation. Anytime they move into a new field and they get onto a new tank, we dump the water and clean it right when they go in. That seems to be it seems to work for us as part of our procedure of just going into new fields, is just to dump water. And for smaller water tanks, we do have a couple heated tanks in our close-up lots where we would maybe keep bulls in the wintertime, or if we had a sick cow up. Those are heated tanks. And the reason we have heated tanks in those lots is because we know we don't necessarily have the animal density there to keep the balls from freezing. So those ones are those small, less than 1 acre fields that we might have 1 or 2 animals in, all have heated tanks. There's not a huge number of those, but I guess we have 3 or 4 of those. And that is just a little bit, maybe a little bit my preference, a lot more my husband's preference. He just personally would rather than having to go out and actually touch each ball on each water tank to check in the wintertime, to just have them heated so he can see, is the water wet or is it frozen in the wintertime. In the summertime, they are really nice, though, in the sense that they have that open surface so that cattle can drink a little bit easier, especially young cattle can drink out of that easier. The negative is they don't have a huge volume of water in them. So the refill rate, you have to make sure you have the right size pipe going into them. Otherwise, cattle just push and shove around them and they don't drink. They can't get the capacity they need in the time they want.
Right. I think, I believe it's the 25%. Generally if they're going as a group, you want to be able to assume at least whatever your herd size is, 25% of your animals are going to drink at once. And so be able to refill within I think it's a 10-minute time span or 20 minutes. I can't.
The rule of thumb I've always heard is that you want your cattle to all drink within 4 hours
Yes,
a day,
right.
which means in 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, they all have to be able to get their fill of water. So if you had 50 cattle and you have 2 hours, that means 25 cattle have to drink in an hour. And that means you need enough water for 25 cattle at 20 gallons per animal. That's 500 gallons you have to get into that tank in an hour. If you have a tank that holds 200 gallons, you have a lot of capacity already there. So you only have to.
That is one good thing that I do like about the tire tanks. That's why they're pretty much below all of our ponds. If we do have some slow flow or something like that, we have that capacity.
Exactly.
They're already formed.
Yep, the tire tanks and the older concrete style tanks, both of them have that benefit of a huge capacity. The ball water tanks, the 4 balls, usually hold a little bit over, right around 100 gallons, which is not terrible, but it is not a huge capacity. We ran a lot of our line as 2-inch line, which maybe was overkill, but it was mainly because I was concerned about refill rates.
Right.
And so we just want to make sure we have enough pressure on that water line, that city water, to make it fill. I've never seen more than 3 or 4 cows standing at a water tank. So I don't think I have a real issue with, other than when there's been one broken. If there's a water tank broken, it's very obvious because they're all congregating there waiting for me to fix it. Or it's running down the hill. One or the other is happening.
Yeah, and it's all just standing there watching it.
Yeah, so that's sort of our approach, is that we primarily have city. I will say though that we do have ponds on the farm, and we've fenced them out so that they're not in the ponds, but we have not gotten rid of ponds on the farm. We still have them there, and they are accessible. We do have gates into them so that if for some reason we had city water down, we could put them very easily onto ponds. At least 2/3 of our pastures would have some form of water other than city water in it, just depending on how we opened up gates. So,
okay.
Not ideal, not what we want to do, but certainly something that if we need.
And you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but with those tire tanks, and we've had the issues in the past too. They do in the summertime. So we have one that's fairly tall or somewhat taller than another one that's a little shorter. On the shorter one, they have a tendency to try to get in there in the summertime to cool down. And so they'll have their front feet standing there. And so we have, at some point, had to put a hay ring around it. And so I've seen in a couple, I think Dr. Higgins talked about it, and some other individuals put hay rings around their tire waters just so the cattle don't get into it in the summertime when it's hot like this.
Yeah, we don't have any tire tanks, so we don't have to usually worry about that. But we did have a group of heifers that were around a concrete tank that's spring fed, and we've actually put city water in that field just to alleviate pressure on that spring fed tank because it does feel slower. It holds a pretty good volume, and there's not a huge number of animals typically on it, but the heifers were playing in it around it because it was really hot. I don't know if you might remember this, but I sent you a picture because we had a heifer turn and and she's all 4 feet are out of the tank, and I thought it was dead. I saw it from the road and immediately turned in to check what was going on, and she was alive. We got her out, but we had to use the tractor and just kind of lift her out. It was a real adventure, but she survived. She actually came out of it with no damage, which is remarkable considering that she was upside down in a water tank.
But who knows how long?
Yeah, you don't know. I mean, it's probably not that long because
she's still alive.
Because she was still alive, and it's not really great on an animal to be upside, and particularly with a rumen.
Yes,
they can get into a lot of trouble if they're upside down. So fortunately, we could see her, we observed it, we caught it early, and she was fine. But you do have to be more cognizant with those bigger tanks about how animals are getting in, and also that they can injure themselves or others in those.
Right, and something we had to be concerned about, and so at some point we did have to put, like I said, that hay rings around it just to protect the tank and the valve, because you see that flow of water coming down the hill, they've broken the ball off.
Isn't that the worst? It's the worst.
It may.
And the worst part is if it happens on a day like this where it's 90 degrees outside, it's not as bad. as long as you catch it before you've like lost all the water in your source. But the worst is when it happens and it's about 40 degrees out and you're in the middle of winter and you're the person that has to get to the bottom of the tank to find the chain to reattach it.
Yeah, and so you just feel this, you get this flood of anger and just like,
you cows don't get water again.
Yeah, it really makes
you
really makes you think about what you're doing with your life, So.
Yeah. Today, actually, it doesn't sound so bad about swimming in a water tank, which normally I would be pretty hesitant to do, but it's pretty hot out currently, so.
It is fairly warm, and, I think we mentioned cleaning out, so the tire tank is a little harder to clean out as well. So I think...
do you get a little more algae in it, too?
It seems like you do get a little more algae at times. It's hard to tell, but I think you do get some algae. I thought the black tire would help, but it's not 100%.
Yeah, the concrete tanks definitely grow algae. That is absolutely part of their nature.
Oh, yeah.
The black tanks, I think just because of the style, they're a little bit shorter, and that black surface, I think they actually don't grow quite as much algae, although anything that feeds out of a groundwater source, like a spring or a pond, I think is more likely to also grow algae just by the nature of what's feeding into the tank compared to city water, which is by nature it's been treated, so it's not going to easily grow quite the same.
Not quite, and we did have so we have kind of two different tire tank designs. So in the one tank we actually put in a bevel almost, where we put in a bevel. So we put additional concrete costs, put it actually in the sidewall, a little bit at the bottom sidewall of the tire, so we can it will funnel down into a drain.
Okay.
Other one is just pretty much it's at the center of the tire, so it's going to be about 4 to 5 inches above where that sidewall is. So getting that last little bit of water and gunk out is always a challenge.
You almost have to scrape it out at certain point, or take a little
bucket.
Small bucket or scoop and do it. Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, I think that's just part of the nature. That is one of the benefits, I think, of the commercial tanks, is that they always have drain spots, and they're always at the bottom corner, and you can fully drain a tank.
Yep.
The other thing I will say is that the tanks that I have, at least, they have a drain spot, but you can usually shut the water off towards the center, so you can close up a tank. So sometimes I will close up part of a tank if I'm cleaning, or if I don't have as many animals on there in the wintertime. Like if I don't want both sides, sometimes I can get away with not having both sides open. So if it's a 4-ball, I can make it go down to a 2-ball.
And just have the one side.
And just have one side with water in it. And that way they can change out the volume more regularly if I have a smaller group of there. And all of that is something you have to consider if you're going for a watering system. It has to work in the summer and have enough volume for the cows in the summer when they drink 20 plus gallons a day during lactation and this heat. That's what you should expect. But then in the wintertime that they might drink 10 or less gallons a day, and that you want to be able to turn over enough water that you don't have freezing in your lines. And it's a balancing act to choose the right size system and make it work.
I mean, it really is, because like the tire tank, the one we had was pond fed, had probably about 4 inches of ice on it, at some point during this winter. But then we just turn on a little bleeder, had a little bleeder valve. It's like, we got plenty of water in the wintertime, so turn on a little bleeder valve. Wasn't a problem after that. It was pretty much, I think you got maybe a very, very thin layer of ice after that.
And it is a little bit of a trick, because then when you have bleeding valves and things like that, then you have to direct that water off the way you want it to. And so there's a lot of moving parts in a water system. It's sometimes a little more complex than people think. I don't know that there's any solution that is 100% perfect all the time, but I think you have to make the right decision for you, for how you want to manage, how it's going to work in your operation.
Yeah, I guess you mentioned it because we have to be cognizant of having a drain pipe for our tire tanks primarily, but something you wouldn't have to worry about with your typical tanks, your ball waters.
Yeah, no, because they shouldn't freeze like that, hopefully. If you have your balls set correctly, they shouldn't be freezing, and that they're sized correctly for the animals. That is the one key, is that you don't want to have a tank like that with no animals on it. If there's no animals ever on it and the balls are fully set up like they're supposed to, it won't really freeze either, as long as you have the right earth tube in the ground. But where you have animals drinking in and out of it, pushing it, and getting some water up on those edges is where you can get some pretty hard freezing if they're not turning it over often enough to keep it broken.
And sometimes, like we had this winter, get that little bit of rainfall and then it freeze.
Yep.
That freeze is that'll.
And then sometimes you do actually literally have to just go out there with hot water and open up a ball or two, and that's okay too.
Yep, it's just part of it at some point. But we still, in the wintertime, we're out there with an axe in the pond. So it's just I know it's odd to say we're talking about the heat wave, but yeah, we still go out there in the wintertime and hit the pond with the axe if they're out in that field.
Yep.
But I think a lot of different options for tank. I think it's really just dependent upon the producer.
Yep.
It depends on whether we want a big volume of water or the ball water a little more resilient in the wintertime.
So I think there's a lot to think about with the watering system. We all have our own preferences. I don't know that there's a right solution. Nothing I'm gonna sell you because no one's giving me commission to sell you anything. So, but we I think we all come up with our own priorities. I think in this watering.
I think really for all these is the water is good to have, but it's really just getting that location, location, set up multiple rotations. I think is key.
I think that's a very fair point. Yeah, having the water tanks in the right location makes a huge difference. We have one farm, and the water tanks are where the person that owns the farm wanted them, but it's not necessarily ideal to the rotation of the cattle. There would be better spots to place them in the field. The spot is not the worst ever. It's certainly better than not having water in those fields, but it's not where I would have necessarily chosen to place it.
Right, and sometimes you just have to, on rented property, anything like that, you kind of have to do what they say.
Yeah.
And so, at that point, do you think about having a maybe a hose or some type of temporary water solution? Or
we did put in 1 or 2 spigots when we built. We actually were able to convince them to put in city water in general before they just had pond water, and the pond was degraded. People hadn't managed it well. They hadn't controlled access to it, and part of the dam was broken down. And so we had a long discussion with them, and they agreed to take some money off of a year of rent, and we installed the watering system. So we provided the labor. They covered the cost of materials to put in some city water. And that was the negotiation, that we couldn't continue renting without city water there.
Right.
And that worked out for both of us. They now have city water. We pay for it. Obviously, we pay all the fees on the city water, but we now know that they're drinking clean water. We know that they're not in the pond. The way that farm lays, there's some environmental concerns. So having them in the pond was a pretty high risk for us.
And they can get stuck as well.
They can get stuck. And actually, the previous renter had 2 cows. He had lost numerous cows, but he clearly had lost 2 cows in the pond in the last winter or 2 before we took over the lease on that farm. I only know because still a number of bones right beside the pond. And once they get stuck in that muck and mud, it's very hard to pull them out. And if you don't get up to them fast enough,
yeah, that can definitely be the end of things.
That can be the end of things. So we were able to negotiate, and we got water. It's not where I would, if I was investing in my own farm, that's not where I would have placed a water tank. But at least I have a water tank and a capture lot around that water tank. So if I have to get something up and work it, I know where my water source is. So I know where they're coming, at least on some type of regular basis, to get water and mineral, and I can capture something.
I forgot to mention this, but we did have a ramp into a pond. So it's kind of limits that, make sure they still have good access, but you kind of limited their access to probably just a 16-foot width, and they have good footing, and you also reduce that angle in which they go down into it. So that's something we put in. Also works, but again, it's just one of those whatever works for your operation. And that was just allowing access for that one. If we had multiple rotation, multiple cows, we needed access on one side. Had to have access, so that's what we put in.
Yeah, I think the limited access into the pond is a very smart idea. If the pond is your water source and a tank off of that pond isn't really practical. Sometimes if a pond is built, it's very difficult to give really good access to a tank depending on how that dam was built.
Yes.
So sometimes it's not terrible at all to do it, and sometimes it is a tremendous amount of work, and you have to find other solutions. While that's not my first choice of a watering system, it's certainly better than just giving free free form access to a pond all the time, because cattle in particular will destroy a dam. They'll walk it down, they'll break it, and the last thing you want is to have invested in a really nice pond that's holding water, that's giving you basically a secure source of water, and then all of a sudden it's not a secure source of water because the water leaks out everywhere.
Yep. Or they push all the dirt in.
Or push the dirt in, yeah.
Yep.
Neither of those are good things. Plus, even the water source becomes contaminated. They're really in it all the time. That limited access discourages them from just standing in the pond the way that they otherwise would.
Yeah, it really does help. If you can limit that access, and at some point they will have to. We have our mineral feeder all about 20 feet away, so they have to go between the two. So it really does help get them moving.
Yep. So those are our watering system thoughts for today. I'm sure there's probably 85 things we didn't talk about with watering systems. There's a lot of considerations in them, but it just so happens that with this heat wave right now and things happening, it just seemed like a timely topic for today.
Yep.
Because it's certainly something I'm looking at and checking all my water sources and making sure everyone's drinking water the way they need to.
Yeah, it's definitely, 6 classes of nutrients. Water is one of them.
That's right. So with that, is there anything happening on the farm next week, Josh? It sounds like things continue to move forward.
Lots and lots of repairs on our hay cutting equipment, and then probably looking at doing more. We still got to spread a lot of manure. Still have to do some more bush hogging, finish up bush hogging.
Okay.
So, and then obviously trying to get the last little bit of hay up. How about you?
We have the hay to finish. We should be done with that hopefully Thursday, but we'll see. With this heat, we might drag it out to Friday. I'm not sure. I'm hoping we get a little bit of rain, but I doubt we're going to get any real rain in this front this weekend. So, but we'll be sort of cranking along on that. Repairs on that tractor that had a pretty major failure last week. It should be going into the shop this coming week.
All right.
We had a 2-week turnaround before they were going to work on it. So crossing our fingers that it does get into a shop in the next week or so. Aside from that, just generally a little bit more bush hogging to do, some more rotation. Bulls are in, and we have some heifers that we're just, we're making sure they're on feed good, as well as a couple steers to feed out. So everyone's doing okay right now. So we're sort of hopefully if we get through hay, it does stabilize the summer for us. I don't know how you feel about that, but getting all of the first cutting of hay done gives us a couple weeks to sort of make sure equipment is ready before we come back in for second cutting. And the second cutting hay will probably happen in early to mid-July, because the first cutting
it was fairly early
of hay this year was fairly early in May. So I would say by middle of July, we should be ready to cut a couple acres on that second cutting of some of our higher quality.
Right. We have usually some fields that kind of on pretty good in clover.
Yep.
So we're hoping for July, middle July. Kind of like you guys, mid-July.
So that's sort of the goal right now, is sort of to give ourselves a couple weeks here to get a bunch of things situated so that when we get back into the hayfield, then that
rock and roll.
We've got some more equipment that's a little functional. A few less repairs, hopefully, on the second cycle than on the first. There's always repairs, though. So we're not convinced that anything other than repairs are coming.
And with that, thank you guys for tuning in.
Thank you.
Have You Heard is a production of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, along with the Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. Discover what's wildly possible at ca.uky.edu.